You're too fat for any man to love." Her father screamed. Then the mountain man said, "No man will ever love a fat pig like you." Marcus Whitfield's words cracked across the dining room like a rifle shot. The chandelier trembled, silver rattled, and servants froze as his youngest, Clara, knelt on the oak floor with her hands braced to keep from collapsing. She was 21, round-cheeked, soft-bodied, and flushed with humiliation, her plain dress askew where a welt from his riding crop had raised the fabric. "Father, please," she whispered, breath hitching. "I'll work harder. You'll do nothing but shame me." Marcus snarled, sweeping aside a plate as if clearing a field of stones. "Henderson wouldn't trade so much as a sway-backed mare for you. Imagine that. Too ugly for a smith with soot in his eyes." He barked a mirthless laugh. At the hearth, Victoria, elegant as a glass knife, sipped broth and judged. "One meal a day," she pronounced, as if reading a sentence. "Let the excess burn off. Perhaps then she'll look human." William, her brother, folded his arms. "If she won't listen, put her out. A pig belongs in the sty, not the parlor." Clara pressed her forehead to the floorboards so they wouldn't see her cry. She had mended their cuffs, polished their boots, and baked their bread. She had swallowed jokes and scraps in silence. But tonight, shame tasted like iron. When Marcus ordered her to kneel through supper, watching them eat while her own plate remained bare, something in her finally cracked. The house settled to sleep under a moon thin as a knife. Wind feathered the curtains. Clara rose on shaking legs, pulled on a shawl, and slipped past the grandfather clock that had told each of her humiliations. Outside, Ashwood's maples grated their bare fingers across the lane. She ran, past the orchard, past the ice-cold wash of the creek, past gates that had never opened for her, and kept running until the manor's lamps were only embers against the dark. By the time the hills shouldered up into timber, breath tore at her ribs. She stumbled beneath a great oak and folded down in the roots like a discarded letter. The night answered with coyotes and the faraway lonesome cry of an owl. If she slept here, the frost would finish what her father had started. A small voice inside said it would be easier that way. "Maybe no one will notice," she whispered to the bark. "Maybe no one will mind." A twig snapped. From the black seam between firs stepped a figure tall as a door and broader than the doorway, a man of the high country, coat hoar-frosted, beard shadowing a face cut from winter itself. He carried a lantern low, amber pooling over boots scuffed by distance. His eyes, deep, steady, unreadable, found the girl in the roots. "That's far enough," he said, voice like a warm hand on frozen air. "You aren't dying out here tonight." The mountain kept its breath. The lantern flame steadied, and Clara, shivering, shamed, and more afraid of hope than of the cold, lifted her head to meet him. Elijah Blackwood hadn't planned to find anyone in the forest that night. He'd spent 3 days running his trap line, boots soaked, coat stiff with sleet, thinking only of the quiet waiting at his cabin. But when the faint sob reached him through the trees, thin, human, desperate, it pulled him like a compass drawn to true north. Now, standing over the shivering shape beneath the oak, he saw she was barely more than a girl. Her hands were scraped, her dress torn, her lips cracked from cold. She looked as if the world had already used her up and left her here to vanish without a sound. "Can you stand?" he asked. Clara blinked, dazed by the lantern light. I don't want to trouble you, sir." Trouble would be leaving you here." Elijah crouched, the boards of his coat creaking. "Come on." When she hesitated, he slid one arm beneath her knees and another behind her shoulders, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. Her head fell against his chest, and for the first time in her life, Clara felt warmth that wasn't followed by cruelty. By the time they reached his cabin, a sturdy structure of pine logs tucked against the mountainside, the snow had started. Elijah kicked the door shut, stoked the embers, and laid her on the bench nearest the fire. He draped a bearskin over her, then poured steaming water into a tin mug and dropped in dried mint leaves. "Drink," he said, offering it. "Slowly." Clara obeyed. The warmth scalded her tongue, but spread sweetly through her chest. She glanced at him over the rim of the mug. In the firelight, his face was lined but strong, his dark hair streaked with silver, his eyes the color of burned oak. There was sadness in them, too deep to name. "You should rest," he said. "I'll see what I can make for food." She swallowed. "Why? Why are you helping me?" He didn't look at her. "Because you were cold." That night, she dreamed of the house she'd left, the laughter of her stepmother, the sting of her father's words, and woke with a cry. Elijah was already by the hearth, adding another log. "Bad dreams?" he asked. Clara nodded, embarrassed. "I should leave in the morning. I'll find my way to town." "Town's 15 miles through rough country," he said. "You wouldn't make it a mile in that dress." "I can't stay," she whispered. "If they find me—" He turned then, slowly. "Who?" And so she told him, every word, from the first insult to the last blow. How her father had called her worthless, how her family had laughed while she knelt, how she had run without a coat, hoping to disappear before dawn. Elijah listened without interrupting. His jaw clenched once, twice, and when she finally fell silent, the only sound was the pop of sap in the fire. "They don't own you," he said at last. "You hear me?" Clara wiped her eyes. "They're my blood." "Then you've paid your debt in full." He leaned back, the light catching the thin white scar along his throat. "No man or woman has the right to break another like that." Something broke inside her then, not from pain, but from hearing words she'd never been given. She pressed the blanket to her face and wept. Elijah waited until her sobs slowed before standing. "You can sleep there," he said, nodding to the cot near the wall. "I'll keep the fire going." When she finally lay down, exhaustion claimed her. Elijah sat by the window, watching the snow thicken outside. He hadn't meant to care, but there was something about her, her quiet endurance, her trembling dignity, that reached through the armor he'd worn since the winter he'd lost everything. At dawn, Clara woke to the smell of coffee and bread. Elijah was at the table, his broad back to her, shoulders rising and falling as he poured steaming liquid into 2 mugs. "I thought you'd gone," she said softly. He turned, faint amusement ghosting his face. "Not yet." She rose, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. "I'll be gone today. I promise." He studied her, the bruise fading along her jaw, the defiance flickering like a candle in her eyes. "You're in no shape for travel. You'll stay till the weather turns." Her lip trembled, but she nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood." "Elijah's fine," he said, setting a mug in front of her. "You can start by eating." Clara wrapped her hands around the cup, letting the warmth sink into her fingers. For the first time since she could remember, someone had spoken her name without contempt. She didn't know how long this fragile kindness would last, but for one morning at least, she felt safe enough to breathe. The wind howled outside, but inside the cabin, the firelight held steady. The snow stopped falling 2 days later, leaving the forest draped in white silence. Smoke curled from Elijah's chimney like a ribbon against the morning sky. Clara stood by the window, watching sunlight break through the branches, her breath fogging the glass. She'd slept longer than she'd meant to, and every dawn she woke expecting him to tell her to leave. But each day Elijah only said the same few words, "Eat first." That morning he saddled his horse and packed snares, moving with the quiet precision of a man who knew every motion mattered. "I'm checking the northern ridge," he said. "Stay by the fire. Wolves come down in cold weather." "I can help," Clara offered softly. "I could carry wood or fetch water." He looked at her, the shadow of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "You can, but not today. Rest first." The door closed behind him, and for a long time the only sound was wind sifting through pine needles. Clara cleaned, cooked, folded blankets that didn't need folding. Anything to keep her hands busy, because when she stopped moving, her thoughts returned. Her father's voice haunted her most. "No man will ever love you." Each word still cut like a blade, but the edges dulled when she remembered Elijah's eyes, steady, unflinching, when she told him the truth. By dusk, she heard hoofbeats crunch through the snow. She hurried to open the door, and the cold burst in around him like a ghost. Elijah entered, carrying 2 rabbits and a small sack of pine cones. "You didn't have to wait up," he said, unbuckling his coat. "I wasn't tired," she lied. "Dinner's ready." He paused, glancing at the pot simmering on the fire. "You can cook." Clara smiled faintly. "My stepmother never let me eat much, but she made sure I learned to feed everyone else." That earned a quiet sound from him, half laugh, half sigh. They ate together without much talk. Outside, snow melted from the eaves, dropping in soft rhythms. Inside, the air smelled of stew and smoke and something else. Something alive. When she reached to take his bowl, their hands brushed. Elijah froze. So did she. For a heartbeat, silence deepened, the kind that holds every unsaid thing. Then he drew back, voice rough. "You should sleep." She wanted to ask if she'd done something wrong, but the words caught in her throat. So she nodded and went to her cot, her cheeks burning in the dark. The next morning, she woke early. The hearth had gone cold. Elijah was already outside, splitting logs, the swing of his axe clean and rhythmic. Clara wrapped herself in a shawl and stepped onto the porch. He glanced up, brow furrowed. "You shouldn't be out without boots." I wanted to help. She lifted a smaller hatchet. "Teach me." He hesitated, then handed her a shorter piece of wood. "Keep your hands firm. Let the blade do the work." Her first swing barely cut the bark. Elijah moved behind her, his hands covering hers, guiding the motion. She felt the heat of him through her sleeves, the weight of his breath near her ear. "Like this," he murmured. "Don't fight it. Follow through." The log split cleanly. Clara laughed, startled. It had been years since she'd laughed freely. Elijah stepped back, eyes flicking to her face. That sound, light, unguarded, seemed to undo something inside him. "You learn fast," he said quietly. "You teach well." For the first time, his mouth curved into a true smile, and she felt it like sunlight through frost. Over the next week, they worked side by side. She mended his shirts with thread she'd found in an old drawer. He built her a stool by the window so she could sew while watching the snow fall. When she pricked her finger, he caught her hand before she could pull away, pressing a cloth to the spot. His fingers were rough, but his touch was careful. "You don't have to," she began. "I know," he said, "but I want to." She looked at him then, really looked, the strong lines of his face softened by the firelight, the scar along his jaw catching gold at the edges. He noticed her gaze and shifted, clearing his throat. "You should rest soon. Tomorrow we'll need more water from the spring." When she lay in bed that night, she stared at the wooden beams above and whispered to herself, "He doesn't see me like they did." The truth was, she didn't see herself that way any more either. 3 days later, a storm rolled in from the west. The wind howled, rattling shutters and filling every seam of the cabin with cold breath. Elijah kept the fire high, pulling his coat around Clara's shoulders when she shivered. "You'll catch your death sitting up," he said. "What about you?" "I've lived through worse." Clara hesitated, then whispered, "You don't have to always be strong." His eyes met hers across the flickering firelight, dark, storm-tossed, searching. For a moment, he looked as if he might speak. Instead, he reached across the space between them and set another log on the flames. "Get some sleep," he said softly. But long after the storm had passed, neither of them did. The fire burned low, their shadows merging on the wall, two lonely souls who had begun, without meaning to melt the ice around their hearts. Winter deepened around the cabin until the forest itself seemed to sleep. The snow climbed halfway up the windows, muffling every sound except the steady crackle of firewood. Inside, life had found its rhythm, quiet, simple, steady. Each morning, Elijah rose before dawn. He moved with that calm certainty of a man who'd lived years by the land's rules, checking traps, chopping logs, bringing back what the mountain offered. Clara would wake to the smell of coffee already brewing, his coat hanging by the door, a small note scratched in rough handwriting, "Eat first." At first, she'd only peek through the frost-glazed window when he worked outside. Watching him split wood, his breath misting in the air, she realized she had never seen strength used so gently. There was power in his arms, yes, but not violence. When he carried logs, he did it with quiet precision, not pride. By mid-morning, she would start the chores, sweeping, mending, tending the small herbs that grew in a clay pot by the sill. She found peace in the repetition. Every movement rebuilt a piece of her that her father's cruelty had shattered. When Elijah returned, his boots thudding softly across the wooden floor, Clara always had something waiting on the stove. "You don't have to," he'd say every time. "I know," she'd reply, setting a bowl in front of him, "but I want to." The first few days he ate in silence, wary of the warmth, but soon the space between their words began to fill, not with talk, but with small things. A glance, a nod, the sound of 2 spoons against tin. One afternoon, when the weather eased, Elijah began repairing a broken section of roof. Clara followed him outside, shawl tight around her shoulders. "You'll freeze," he said, half smiling. "I won't if I help." He hesitated but didn't stop her. Together they hauled planks up the ladder. She passed him nails, her fingers red from the cold. At one point, her foot slipped on the icy rung, and she gasped. Elijah caught her wrist instantly, steadying her with one hand around her waist. Their eyes met, hers wide with surprise, his dark with something unspoken. For a long heartbeat, neither moved. Then he cleared his throat and helped her back down. "You should stay on the ground," he murmured. "I can't build roofs and catch fallen women at the same time." Clara laughed, light, shy, genuine. "Then you'd better finish fast." Elijah turned away, but the corner of his mouth lifted. It was the first smile she'd ever seen reach his eyes. By evening, they sat together at the table. Clara's hair had come loose, curling softly around her cheeks. Elijah, washing his hands at the basin, glanced at her reflection in the window and felt that strange ache again, familiar yet foreign, the kind of ache he'd buried with his past. When she noticed him looking, she lowered her gaze. "What's wrong?" He dried his hands slowly. "Nothing. Just the cabin's quieter than it used to be." "Do you miss it?" He shrugged, staring into the fire. "Sometimes quiet makes you remember things you thought you'd forgotten." Clara folded her hands. "Like her?" Elijah's jaw tightened. He didn't ask how she knew. "You don't have to tiptoe around ghosts, Clara." "I'm not," she said softly. I want you to know I'm not here to replace anyone." He turned toward her then, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "You couldn't if you tried." The words sounded sharp, but his tone wasn't. It was weary, gentle, filled with something she couldn't name. She nodded, understanding. Days turned into weeks. The storm outside eased, and so did the distance between them. Clara began humming while she worked. Elijah started listening. She found herself baking biscuits again, shaping them imperfectly but with care. He repaired the chair she favored, sanding it smooth where the wood had splintered. Sometimes in the evenings they would read from the single book Elijah owned, a tattered collection of poetry Rachel had once loved. Clara's voice was soft and unsure at first, but as she read aloud, the words filled the cabin like music. "Love is not kindled in ease," she read one night, her fingers tracing the faded ink. "It is forged in cold and fed by hands that refuse to let go." When she looked up, Elijah was watching her. "That line," he said quietly, "was her favorite." Clara's heart clenched. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have—" "Don't be." His voice cracked on the last word. "It's good to hear it again." He stood and moved to the window, staring out into the snow. Clara followed, her steps light. She must have been someone very special. "She was," he exhaled. "But life didn't stop when she did. It just slowed." Clara wanted to reach out, to rest her hand on his arm, but she held back. Instead, she whispered, "Maybe it's time it moved again." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind outside. Then Elijah looked at her, really looked, and something softened behind his eyes, like a door creaking open after years of silence. "Maybe it is," he said. The first signs of spring came late, a patch of thawed earth, the call of a thrush at dawn. Elijah started spending longer hours outside, and Clara joined him, planting small seeds near the porch. She knelt in the mud, hands dirty, hair tousled, and laughed when the wind carried soil across her face. "Look at me," she said, grinning. "Your cabin's gardener looks like a mess." Elijah studied her for a moment, the sun cutting gold through her curls. "You look alive." Her smile faltered, replaced by something tender. "I didn't, before." He crouched beside her, brushing dirt from her cheek with his thumb. You do now." The air between them changed, slowly, quietly, like snow melting into a stream. When he leaned closer, Clara didn't move away. He kissed her forehead first, then her lips, soft, uncertain, reverent. She gasped, not from surprise, but from how right it felt. The world outside vanished, the cabin, the fire, the ache. They all dissolved into the simple truth of two lonely hearts finding warmth again. When they finally broke apart, Elijah rested his forehead against hers. "You sure about this?" Clara nodded, tears bright in her eyes. "I've never been more sure of anything." He smiled, slow, rare, unguarded. "Then stay." "I wasn't planning on leaving," she whispered. That night, the cabin glowed brighter than it ever had, and though the storm outside still raged in the mountains, inside they had built a quiet world of their own, one made not from perfection, but from the courage to begin again. Spring in the high country came slow, half reluctant. The snow melted in streaks, not waves. The pines dripped cold water that smelled of iron and earth. Elijah repaired the traps, restocked supplies, and kept to his old silences. Clara planted wild herbs by the window and sewed a curtain from scraps of Rachel's old linen. But even as warmth returned to the land, shadows began to creep back into their days. It started with strangers in town. A merchant who'd seen Elijah trading furs mentioned to a traveler that a woman had been living with him up the ridge. Big girl, pretty face, quiet sort. By the time that story reached Ashwood, it was a spark landing in dry grass. Marcus Whitfield heard it first from a dinner guest. He laughed, but it was a sharp, ugly sound. "So the little sow's alive after all," he said, "and ruttin' with a trapper." His pride burned hotter than any love could have. He sent word to the sheriff, "Find her, bring her back, or bring proof she was dead." Clara didn't know any of this. She only noticed how Elijah began to pause longer at the window, eyes scanning the tree line. When she asked, he shrugged. Tracks, maybe wolves, maybe men. One evening she caught him oiling his rifle. "You think someone's coming?" she asked. "I always think someone's coming," he replied. "That's how I stay alive." The way he said it made her chest tighten. She wanted to ask about the scar along his side, the old burn marks on his wrist, the way he sometimes woke before dawn breathing like he'd been running for miles. But she'd learned Elijah revealed himself slowly, in slivers. Later that night, when they lay by the fire, she said quietly, "You don't sleep much." He looked into the flames. "I don't like dreams. They take me places I can't go back to." "Rachel?" He nodded once. "I used to blame God for it, for the snow, the distance, the way I couldn't reach her in time. But truth is, I went down that mountain too late. I was hunting when she called for me." "You didn't know?" He laughed without humor. "That's what everyone says." Clara sat up, took his hand, and pressed it against her heart. "You can't save the dead, Elijah, but you saved me." He stared at her hand over his, and for the first time the weight in his shoulders seemed to ease. A week later, while Elijah was at the stream-setting lines, Clara heard the sound of hoofbeats far below the ridge. She went still, listening. One horse, maybe two. Her father's voice echoed from memory, "You'll crawl back one day begging." She closed the shutters, heart pounding. When Elijah returned, she told him. His expression hardened. "They found us." "Maybe it's nothing. Men don't ride that far into these woods for nothing." He loaded the rifle, packed flour and salt into a sack. If they come, you take the trail east to the bluff. There's a cave there. Stay until I come. I won't leave you." He looked at her then, fierce and tender. "You will if I tell you. You're not dying because of me." Clara wanted to argue, but the look in his eyes stopped her. That night they didn't speak much. She sat beside him as he cleaned his knife. He reached once to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, then let his hand fall away. "Whatever happens," she said softly, "I'd rather face it with you." His voice broke on the whisper. "You already have." At dawn, the riders came. Marcus Whitfield dismounted first, flanked by 2 hired men and Sheriff Lang, a man who valued gold more than law. Their boots crunched on the frozen ground as they approached the cabin. Elijah stepped out to meet them, rifle across his chest. "Morning," the sheriff called. "Got business here, Blackwood." Elijah's gaze didn't waver. "What kind of business?" Marcus pushed forward, his fine coat brushing the snow. "Family business. My daughter ran off. Fat fool thinks she can shame me by hiding with a mountain tramp." The insult rolled off Elijah like rain on stone. "You lost your right to call her daughter when you drove her out," Marcus sneered. "She's blood, and blood obeys." "Not anymore." Elijah's voice turned quiet. "Dangerous. She's free." Lang shifted nervously. "Let's not make trouble. We can settle this peaceful." "There's nothing peaceful about stealing a woman's life back," Elijah interrupted. The sheriff's hand twitched toward his holster. Inside the cabin, Clara clutched her shawl, tears stinging her eyes as she listened. Every instinct screamed to run, but another voice, stronger now, told her she couldn't hide forever. She opened the door. Marcus turned, disbelief curdling into fury. "You dare show yourself?" Clara stood on the threshold, trembling but upright. "You told me no man could love me," she said. "You were wrong." Marcus's face darkened. "You ungrateful." Elijah stepped forward. "One more word, and I'll forget you're her kin." The hired men reached for their guns. The next few moments blurred into thunder. Gunfire cracking through the morning air, smoke rising in sharp gray curls. Elijah moved like a storm, his rifle roaring, his knife flashing in the cold light. When it was over, the snow was red, and only the sheriff's horse was still running. Marcus had fallen, wounded in the leg, staring up at the man who'd undone him. "Kill me, then," he spat. "You think she'll thank you for it?" Elijah stood over him, chest heaving. "I don't kill broken men." He turned to Clara. "Go inside." But Clara shook her head. "No, I need to finish this." She knelt beside her father, tears and fury mixing in her voice. "You made me believe I was nothing. You almost succeeded. But look at me, Father. I'm still here." He turned away, unable to meet her eyes. When she rose, Elijah reached for her hand. "It's over." She looked at him, breathing hard. "No, it's beginning." By sunset, the cabin was quiet again. Smoke rose from the chimney, mingling with the pink light of evening. Clara sat on the porch, while Elijah bound his wounds, the smell of gunpowder still hanging in the air. "You should have let me handle it," he said softly. "I did," she replied. "But I had to speak for myself, too." He looked at her, pride shining through the fatigue. "You did more than speak. You stood." Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. "Because you showed me how." The mountain wind sighed through the pines. Somewhere far below, the river kept running, carrying away the last echoes of the fight. And for the first time in years, Elijah allowed himself to believe that redemption might not come from forgetting the past, but from standing beside someone brave enough to face it. 2 nights passed before the world around them truly went quiet again. The snow hid the scars of battle, the forest swallowed the echoes. But silence never meant safety in the mountains. It only meant something was watching. Elijah knew it. He kept his rifle close, his steps careful, his gaze sweeping the horizon even when he pretended to rest. Clara saw the exhaustion in him, the slow ache when he thought she wasn't looking. He had fought for her, bled for her, and yet he looked more haunted than victorious. "You haven't slept," she whispered one morning, laying a hand on his shoulder. He shook his head. The sheriff rode off. "He'll bring others next time." "They'll come for revenge." "They'll come for pride," Elijah said. "Men like Marcus don't die quietly, and men like Lang don't forgive losing face." Clara stood still for a moment, then said with quiet certainty, "Then we'll be ready." He turned toward her, this girl who'd once trembled at her own shadow, now standing steady before him. "You're not meant to live by a gun," he said softly. "You're meant for gardens and light, not powder and blood." "I'm meant to live," she answered, "and you're the reason I can." By dusk, storm clouds rolled over the peaks again, dark and heavy. Elijah built a barricade along the porch, his movements sure and grim. Clara loaded bullets the way he'd taught her, her fingers steady despite the tremor in her heart. The first shot came just after midnight, a sharp crack in the distance, then another. Lantern light flickered through the trees, 6 riders moving fast. "They found us," Elijah murmured, handing her the rifle. "Inside, behind the stove." Clara gripped his arm. "You can't take them all." He smiled faintly. "I don't need to. I just need them to believe I can." She wanted to scream, to beg him not to go, but something in his eyes, calm, resolute, held her still. So she kissed him once, fiercely, as if she could pour all her strength into him. "Come back," she whispered, "no matter what happens. Come back." "I will," he promised, brushing her cheek with his thumb, "because I have someone to come back to." Then he was gone. The night exploded into thunder. Gunfire split the air, echoing through the valley. Clara pressed her hands over her ears, praying. She counted every shot. 1, 2, 3. The pause between each one stretched long enough to make her heart stop. When the door finally burst open, she screamed until she saw him. Elijah, staggering, blood streaking his arm, but alive. He slammed the bolt shut behind him, panting. "They're gone," he gasped. "Lang's down. The rest ran." Clara ran to him, catching his weight before he fell. "You're hurt." "It's nothing." He smiled through the pain. "We made it." She pressed her forehead to his chest, sobbing. I thought I'd lose you." "You can't lose what you fought for," he whispered. "You earned this." Outside, the snow began again, soft, relentless, erasing the tracks of violence until the world looked untouched. By morning, sunlight touched the cabin roof. Elijah sat on the porch, arm bandaged, eyes on the horizon. Clara brought him coffee and wrapped her shawl around his shoulders. "What now?" she asked. He looked at her for a long time before answering. "Now we live on our terms." She smiled, tears still bright in her eyes. "Together? Always?" He reached for her hand, and she placed it in his, small, warm, steady. They sat there as the wind passed through the pines, carrying away the last echoes of fear. The mountain would remember their story in silence, but the two souls who had survived it needed no witness. For them, survival itself was the loudest vow. "You're safe here," Elijah said, voice rough with truth. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the sunlight spill through the trees. "Then this is home," she whispered, "if you'll have me." He smiled, kissed her hair, and said the words he'd never thought he'd speak again. "I already do." The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence so pure it almost hurt to breathe. Snow blanketed the valley in shimmering light, and smoke rose gently from the cabin chimney like a promise that life still endured. Clara woke first that morning. The fire had burned low, but Elijah's arm was still draped over her, heavy and warm, anchoring her to the world she thought she'd lost. For a long moment she simply watched him, the slow rhythm of his breathing, the faint crease between his brows, the streak of silver in his dark hair. Once she had feared this man, then she'd leaned on him. Now she could not imagine a life without him. She rose quietly, wrapped herself in her shawl, and stepped outside. The air was sharp, the kind that bit at the lungs and made her feel alive. A blue jay sang from a nearby pine. The world, in its own way, was beginning again. Behind her, the door creaked. Elijah appeared, still barefoot, his hair tousled. "You shouldn't be out here in the cold," he murmured. Clara smiled over her shoulder. "And miss this?" She gestured at the mountains, bathed in gold by the rising sun. "It's like the world forgot how cruel it can be." He stepped beside her, the boards groaning under his weight. "The world never forgets," he said quietly, "but sometimes it forgives." Clara turned toward him. "You mean you forgive?" Elijah's eyes softened. "Maybe that's what survival really is, learning to forgive what broke you." She reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining in the cold morning air. For a long while they said nothing. There was no need. The forest, the snow, the sky, they all seemed to bow around them as if recognizing a truth older than pain itself. Inside, the fire began to crackle again. The cabin smelled of pine smoke and coffee. Elijah poured 2 cups and handed one to her. "We'll need to go into town soon," he said. "Get supplies, face folks again." Clara sipped her drink, the warmth spreading through her. "Do you think they'll talk?" "They always talk." He smiled faintly. "Let them. They don't get to tell our story." Clara looked at him, her heart swelling with a quiet courage she hadn't known she possessed. "Then we'll tell it ourselves." Elijah nodded, reaching out to brush a stray lock of hair from her face. "You're not the girl who ran into the woods anymore." "No," she said softly. "I found my way out." He leaned down and kissed her forehead. "You're safe here," he whispered, the same words he'd spoken that first night. Clara closed her eyes, smiling through tears. "It's home now," she said, her voice trembling, "because you're in it." The sun climbed higher, setting the snow ablaze with light. Inside the small cabin on the mountain, 2 souls who had been broken by the world began to build it anew, quietly, stubbornly, beautifully. Every time I write stories like this, I'm reminded that love isn't about perfection. It's about survival, healing, and the courage to begin again. Clara's journey wasn't from weakness to beauty. It was from shame to strength. Elijah didn't rescue her from the world. He taught her to stand against it. And somewhere out there, maybe you're listening from your own quiet mountain, still waiting for warmth after a long winter. Tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Because as long as you still believe in love that forgives, protects, and rebuilds, the next story will be waiting for you.